Thank you, David. It's fabulous to be here today. As he mentioned, I have a very long-standing connection to Australia because I defended my dissertation when Charmin had moved here, and but she never made the same mistake twice. I'm the only American student she's had. And so, Charmin, I promise I will do my best to not be a tall poppy or a bogan, and respect Australian cultural norms as I share with you an adventure that I've just ended that's been a real interesting piece. I've been a scientist practitioner and worked in many countries, but for the last 4.5 years I've been in India, working for probably the iconic Indian multinational. It was the company that created the idea of doing software in a developing country. It was started with $200 US, 10,000 rupees in 1981, and it's extremely noteworthy for being very much a paragon of ethical virtue and thinking beyond the classics. So I just moved out of India 1 month ago, and so I'm going to talk extensively with Infosys Blessings, and I want to thank them for allowing me to share some of the Infosys work, even though I'm not there anymore, because I hope you find it interesting and useful as you go on your own science and practice journeys. As I moved to India, I had always been doing work, beginning with Charmin, thinking about creating value. At that time, in my earliest career, it was teams under stress. Later, I launched corporate universities in a few countries around the world. But going to India, I had a really different worldview, and I had a different perspective. So I'm not going to only talk about practice and science at Infosys. I want to give you some perspective that I gained in that journey that I think you might find useful. It really struck me moving to a developing country which was growing like gangbusters, but that was really recently industrializing, that these things we do as IO-psychologists are pretty central to what life requires for our species. Companies are a tool that our species use to feed our family and make a better life for themselves, and of course we're the experts of people at work. And what a unique opportunity to influence 1.3 billion people that will soon pass China up with a scientist practitioner view. But I moved there, knowing full well that it was a very corrupt country. If you see this graphic, you can see this is an international corruption index, blue meaning relatively uncorrupt and red meaning very corrupt. Australia, you're in pretty good shape, not quite as good as New Zealand or Sweden, but certainly better than the US, and you can see India's quite red. My wife is an IO-psychologist, she's also Indian, so I knew this going into it, but living in a deeply corrupt, not company, but society, changed my worldview on science and practice and the importance of our work. And I agreed to coming off the heels of Enron, so I was interviewing them in 2008. Enron, and especially Bernie Madoff, was very front and center. So I'd been thinking about value creation, I was thinking about utility analysis before this, but then as Enron and MCI WorldCom and 9/11 and then Bernie Madoff happened, I started thinking about value destruction and how come our field isn't saying that much about it, this cataclysmic big picture destruction that's hurting lots of people around the world. And my second week in India is when Satyam hit, and I was actually in a strategic planning session with the founders in Mysore, India, when it hit, and ironically, Satyam in Hindi means truth, but it was India's Enron. And it's representative, regrettably, of many, many companies in India except the one I was working in, which is what attracted me to go there and stayed for 4.5 years. But it wasn't just unethical leader behavior that was troubling me, and certainly troubling the founders of Infosys that wanted me to help. They wanted me to help them sustain their legacy of values-led, visionary leadership that challenges traditional assumptions and redefines excellence. It was also leaders that made horrific decisions about risk and uncertainty, like the Lehman debacle. So I kept thinking of these cataclysmic, big, relatively rare events, but I also noticed, having spent my whole career not in academia, but in practice, that there were more day-to-day examples of this. And so I started to get really interested in how do we both create more value using our science, and how do we avoid some of this value destruction? But what's very seminal to me as I read some of the history of India and why the culture is the way it is that it's had a multi-century history of oppression. The first publicly traded corporation in the world, as we currently define them, with a stock exchange, was the British East India Company that was allowed by the British Crown to own India. And this is an organization, as I read it, that has a culture where it was completely fine to lie, cheat, steal, and even murder as long as it was in India, and as long as the company was making its money. So you can imagine, for centuries of Mughal and British rule, creating an environment that's maybe hostile to normal IOPSYCH work and normal business practices, it gave me a different insight into why things may be the way they are. And I ended up reading the biology literature, saying, these leaders are what biologists call parasites. In fact, they call them kleptoparasites, which are a class of species that either live fully or partially by stealing resources from others. And I thought, okay, well, maybe that biology doesn't have every answer for solving some of these problems, but what if it gives us fresh ideas that either reference good evidence, good science we already use, or stimulate new hypotheses that are worthy of testing and can perhaps avoid some of the value destruction and improve the value creation. So I went to some trouble to read as much parasitology, immunology, virology literature just to say, can we prevent and treat this stuff in a way that's similar to the very work I'd done with Charmin earlier, with her team decision-making under stress, but also the way your physician or an Olympic gold medalist coach might do with very high-performing people, like the ones I got to work with at Infosys. The antithesis of all that corruption and destruction were the wonderful people I got to work with. Narayana Murthy is an incredibly humble, self-effacing billionaire. He was the founder of Infosys. He is currently the chairman, and he, long before it was fashionable, said that we will have an experiment in poverty reduction. We want to be known for living our values. We will never give a bribe. We will never be unfair to people, and we are going to create a software company in a country that has no electrical infrastructure. And we can't afford a computer, but we will still create a world-class organization with a 10,000 rupee, $200 angel investment from his wife. And it's now a $35 billion multinational, 165,000 employees in 40 countries around the world. And his goal for me was to sustain that legacy, because he and the rest of the founders were on their way to retirement. And they wanted to make sure that they leverage the best science available to scale the different interventions that our field may have to offer in finding junior people, nurturing them with the best available evidence, and making sure that they're ready to take on the senior-most positions. This is a company that continues to hire 30 to 50,000 new employees every single year, most of whom come from India. And so they were very concerned, knowing full well that India has this deeply corrupt history and current economic environment, that they want to avoid that. And they spend 6 months of immersive development on the employees to help them avoid being unethical, being more cross-culturally savvy, and getting to a minimum US undergraduate level of expertise in computer science. This was when Forbes was first launched in India in 2009, this was the third cover page on the rock stars that I was working for. The third guy from the right was my boss, Chris Gopalakrishnan, who's the executive co-chairman currently. These are what Henry Ford would have been to the United States. These are the people that created 10,000 US dollar millionaires. They have really changed the face of India, and many, many parents would like for their children to follow in these leaders' footsteps. But one of the areas of creative inspiration for me was thinking about this parasites in other disciplines, to say, how have other disciplines borrowed ideas from biology and implemented them successfully? One of the very first modern version of biomimetics or bio-inspired solutions comes from the gentleman who invented Velcro. His name is George de Mistral. He was a hunter in the Swiss Alps, and he had burrs sticking all over to him and his dog, and he looked in a microscope and basically copied how the burr had tiny hooks hooking into himself. And so biomimicry is a very contemporary way that some of our engineering colleagues are thinking about solving engineering problems. If we could cue the video, please. This is an example from MIT, being inspired for a new way of locomotion from a snail.
It's being developed in the Hatsopoulos Microfluids Lab here at MIT. We're interested in the fluids lab at studying fluids at very small scales. Microfluidics is becoming increasingly important today, mostly because of medical and biological applications. People are learning to build these labs on a chip, in which you have fluids that flow through very small channels. Maybe chemical reactions take place in those channels. And the first thing you need to know if you're really going to design these chips effectively is you have to understand the fluid motion at those small scales. A real snail moves by a series of stretching and compression waves. Basically, the only way the snail interacts with the substrate is through a thin layer of fluid. The slime is actually incredibly interesting. It's not a Newtonian fluid, which means that the characteristics of the fluid change depending on how you stress it. And when you go to very, very small scales, suddenly you have a completely different set of forces that become important. And you have to learn to either beat those forces or use them to your advantage. RoboSnail is answering the question of how can we use these high pressures in thin films to actually get something to propel itself. From back here.
We'll stop the tape here. Thank you. So this is one example. Another example is from medicine. There's a certain kind of shark in the Galapagos Islands whose scales are such that it can never get the lampreys or other parasites to attach to it. And so hospital-borne infections, called nosocomial infections, kill people, not from what they came into the hospital with, but from bacteria and disease that's in the hospital. So they've actually mimicked the shark scale at a nanoscale device and put them in hospitals now to minimize or eliminate hospital-borne infections. Mercedes-Benz has looked at the boxfish, like this one here, to mimic the hydrodynamics of the boxfish on a prototype car for the Mercedes-Benz. So this is biomimicry, where they're trying to copy what nature has done to solve a human problem. The key idea here is in 3.5 billion years of evolution, there are hundreds of millions of geniuses that solve problems in a radically different way than our species normally does. Now, okay, that's interesting for engineering. We're a bunch of psychologists, and I was looking after leaders at Infosys. So what does that mean for psychology? Well, it turns out that in the Korean War, a social psychologist named William McGuire had heard about some of the GIs that when the conflict stopped, had chosen to remain on the North Korean side and tried to study the social persuasion involved and why is it that people fighting in one point in time now are on the other side and choosing to advocate and support the North. And at the same time, in the 50s, there were many instances of vaccines being developed where a weakened form of a virus could be injected and that the body could build an immunity to it. So we thought, well, maybe in social persuasion, we can do the same thing. So he was inspired by vaccination to see if we could inoculate people against inappropriate, unethical, dysfunctional forms of persuasion. And sure enough, he found that in many examples from preventing people from starting to smoke to credit card abuse, he was able to find evidence that supports this inoculation theory. So I thought, okay, I've been working for many years with Robert Cialdini, who is the world's most cited social psychologist. Most definitions of leadership have some word of either persuasion or influence in them. And he's dedicated his career to this kind of work where he has taken all of his colleagues and his own research and tried to boil it into 6 practical things to trigger others to say yes to your request. And he does it in an entirely ethical way, and when we teach it, we teach the science behind it. His principles are highly relevant to avoiding parasites from hijacking these principles and using them against you. And so just briefly, his principle of reciprocity is the principle that in every culture ever studied, there's an obligation to give back to those that have given to you first. The principle of liking is that we prefer to be persuaded by people that like us and that we like back. Consensus is a principle that we look around at what other people are doing in situations of uncertainty to figure out what's right for us. Authority is the one that any of us professionals want others to take our guidance, our expertise seriously. Consistency is a self-persuasion principle that we want to remain consistent with our prior choices or stands on issues. And then lastly is the most primitive of Cialdini's principles, the principle of scarcity, which even single-celled organisms respond to. And that's, we are much more motivated to avoid losing things than we are to gain the same amount. And so his whole approach is to avoid people that had tricked him when he was younger, that had smuggled in some of these tricks, and that's actually stimulated him to want to be a psychologist. And his work, together with inoculation theory by McGuire, helped me say, okay, well maybe some of these biology-inspired solutions can have some play in psychology, and especially IO. So I reviewed the parasitology, immunology, virology literature. I actually originally just thinking, can I get a cool idea that I can test around avoiding this value destruction? And it occurred to me, well, I've never worked in agribusiness, but there's a whole industry around actual biological parasite elimination. I'm sure this is common in Australia, coming into all the screening procedures to avoid parasites from infecting Australia. This isn't news to you, but as an American, I wasn't thinking about this. So it actually, biological parasites hurt business, and so some of our normal IO procedures should be around those. I was thinking of them more in terms of, can it give us a fresh idea worthy of testing? And I got sick many times in India from this particular parasite. In India they call it Delhi belly, in America they call it Montezuma's revenge. But it helps point a spotlight on our normal pre-hire selection procedures, which is how I started doing assessment work at Infosys. It also suggests, how do we diagnose and prevent that kind of destructive behavior in organizations when it's occurring. And so it reminded me that there's a whole literature on organizational citizenship behavior that we should not ignore, and that would be one way that in a large multinational you could systematically include in a performance review process to detect people that seem to be hurting more than they're helping, people that are acting parasitically. This is an Australian duck, and this is fascinating for me because this acanthocephala in the red here actually it infects a crustacean whose normal motive is to hide in the darkness to avoid this Australian duck from eating it. But that parasite actually brainjacks the crustacean to get the crustacean to swim into the light, which increases the probability that the duck will eat it and that the parasite can continue its life cycle. And this reminded me exactly of most of the non-evidence-based consultants that would constantly want to sell me stuff and infect my leaders that I would have to, detox and hopefully teach them enough of the science and persuade them to avoid the toxic fiction masquerading as fact. And so, of course, the cure is evidence-based leadership, which isn't news to IO psychologists. But this may be a metaphor to talk about it, but I'm also hoping that it had more than just a metaphor. And it turns out there's actually a parasite that caused me to have to change kitty litter 2 times, both times when my wife was pregnant, because it infects us and brainjacks us. And there's some empirical evidence that say it actually could change people's personality. I've done a lot of work at Infosys using Australian measurement techniques, especially the many-facet Roche model, which creates engineering-worthy measures that are very appropriate to make sure these kinds of consultants or people in our organizations that are destroying more than they add do not do that. What's brilliant about the many-facet Roche model is that there's several meta-analyses, 3 in the last 4 years, that suggest multi-source are a superior way to measure many things, and many-facet Roche model creates linear measures adjusting for different biases, severity and leniency, and many other biases that are normally present in either classical test theory or item response theory based measures. And so I think this is very important because norms in classical test theory can steer you wrong. In this audience, I'm probably in the 99th percentile in my ability to speak Bengali, but you send me back to India and I'm in the 1st percentile. Roche doesn't have this problem. It measures people and questions with the same ruler, and it takes a mess like this and puts them nicely on a single line, from more to less. You don't have to talk about fancy statistics with people when you give them feedback, so our approach to detect risk in our leaders and mitigate it, we could talk in terms of things they've already mastered, things that are too difficult for them, that we don't want to throw them in the deep end on, versus the things that are just right for them. So Roche measurement was one area that seemed especially important because so much of the biology I was reading suggested nonlinear processes of the sort that David Day looks at in his latent growth modeling over time. When you look at the teams in agribusiness that try and address parasites, the things the parasite eats, like the cows or the sheep that the business is producing, may grow, and that creates opportunities for parasites to have more food. And eventually the parasite eats them enough and it depletes the host. And so there's this ebb and flow over time that really made me think hard about the shared distributed team leadership that David is fond of in terms, especially at the board level of Infosys. Because when there's only 13 people on the Infosys board, they explicitly intend to have people with different expertise so that they can follow others when they have better ideas than they do. So there's an attorney on the board, and obviously in legal matters, the attorney informs the whole board. But this ebb and flow is an idea that I didn't see enough of in the leadership literature. We don't have that many longitudinal models. Certainly just even in the team dynamics literature, it's not integrated terribly well with the leadership literature. So what does all that have to do with I/O and Infosys? Well, much of what I saw in creating value for Infosys and their current business strategy around becoming a consulting firm, much of the academic literature I was reading suggested that there's something to the team literature, but also the expertise they bring to it and the actions they take to scan the environment. The Eurozone, Chinese real estate bubble, there's many macroeconomic things, competitor actions that senior leaders need to cope with, and they need mental models to help them understand them, set goals, come up with winning strategies, leveraging the best ideas on the team. And so I integrated this into the assessments and development that we used at Infosys. But one of the ideas that complements shared team, distributed, and instrumental leadership is an idea that I'm calling oscillating leadership, about including leadership and followership as appropriate. That the best leaders know when to follow and withdraw their expertise, or appropriately follow others with superior expertise to their own on an ongoing basis. But that ebbs and flows, and that they are proactive and courageous when they have the best idea and appropriately influence. So at Infosys, we went to great trouble to create Roche measures, and we were kids in a candy store because we had no constraints on sample size. I looked after 3,000 leaders. I could do any kind of experimental designs I wanted. And I borrowed shamelessly from David Day's language for this. So we had measures of stable individual differences that don't change much. We had our own measure of the Big Five. Then there's semi-malleable dimensions like learning goal orientation that we could coach a little bit, perhaps, but we can't change that much. Then the malleable things that normal training thinks about, mental models, skills. In that group, we considered sort of how we define potential. We had our own version of the full-range leadership model. We adjusted, with the blessings of House and Antonakis, their instrumental leadership model. We had Infosys' own behavioral models, and then consequences of those behaviors. So we called these the 3 Ps. And I promised my boss that I would get 2 times better validity than what they were getting from the external consultant, which was not a tough thing for me to promise, because I'd already seen their tech report, and it was shamefully not very good. But I was able to do 3 replication studies showing good test-retest reliability, showing good validities on a number of areas. All of these we used computer adaptive testing for a variety of reasons. One, it's a heck of a lot shorter, and I don't know of any leader that likes long, tedious surveys or questionnaires. Do you? Maybe Australians are different. So we were able to measure many more things, 42 different scales this year. Before I got there in 2007, they had a panel interview selection procedure that took them a year and a half to fly leaders globally to these different interviews. I was able to shrink that down this year. It was able to be done in 1 month. 10,000 leaders were screened with 25,000 raters, all very scalable with this computer adaptive Roche measurement. So one of the ideas in that instrumentation is to think about how leaders lead and follow dynamically over time, depending on the needs of the team, depending on the needs of the organization. And so this is taking the House and Antonakis model just to show how, when we teach this at Infosys, how that would work. If the leaders are scanning the environment and defining strategy, setting the goals, they may do that as a group, but that at more micro levels, senior leaders may not get involved at all, and then for very specialty functional ideas, they may very well follow others that are deep disciplinary experts. One of the key ideas, as I read the literature, especially from other disciplines, is an idea of constraints. In agriculture, when I read that literature, they have this idea of the law of the minimum that says if they don't have the right configuration of vitamins, minerals, water in the soil, it will minimize or prevent them from having yield in their crops. But it wasn't unique to agriculture. I saw the same thing in software and hardware itself with bottlenecks in internet bandwidth. And this is a picture in Chicago of an intersection that civil engineers call it engineering choke point. Software databases have the same thing. They call it a hotspot when the code all has to wait at a certain point in the database until an order is given. And so I would submit to you that what leaders need to think about, and what I was trying to develop in them, are a way to think about architecting probabilistic systems and thinking about how they can manage and lead and follow those stochastic probabilistic systems appropriately. And why shouldn't we IO psychologists respect our friends in other business sciences, in operations research and industrial engineering? I think we have lots of great contributions in micro level, cognition, affect, trait, behavior. We have many good things we talk about in terms of culture, climate, structure in the macro. But other than teams, we don't have a lot of things to offer, whereas our industrial engineering operations research colleagues have lots of good ideas for us that complement. They have the same care that we do for rigor and hypothesis testing, but they come at organizations from a different angle. And I would suggest that perhaps this is where some of the other alternatives to utility analysis themselves have not been well accepted by senior leaders because they're too discipline-centric. So I would just encourage us IO psychologists to think carefully about the lay public who consume our work and how do they think about what they want to achieve in the organization such that everything is a means to the ultimate value, the ultimate mission, vision, the ultimate objectives of the organization, whether you're not-for-profit, whether you're a for-profit, whether you're a government institution. In those bottlenecks, of course, is where I was most worried about the parasites that I saw in many of the companies I've worked for in the past. Ironically, the American bald eagle is a kleptoparasite, I learned, which maybe that doesn't surprise Australians. It surprised me. So the QC model is what came out of all this reading, inspired originally by things I'd done with Charmin as a scaffolding for helping leaders think about the probabilistic systems they're trying to create and focus their limited time and attention in the places that might matter most. It intended to build a way to think about how we can wrap our arms around different disciplines, respect where we have a contribution to make and where we should follow a different discipline, a way to help leaders cascade their goals and solve what I call the criterion problem so that IO psychology can be more dependent variable focused than we sometimes are. I think if we were more focused on outcomes other people lose sleep over, that they're willing to pay us for, I'm willing to bet that our scientist friends would get funded more frequently and more practitioners would be more open to some of our interventions. So again, Charmin helped influence this with her early work on team decision making. I call the QC model to help people remember the 4 camera angles you can think of in any organizational process that's creating value. And they're all a means to an ultimate purpose. Quality is what is it good for? What is it supposed to be producing for whom? Cost is the resources that were consumed to create it. Quantity is the volume, how many have to flow through it. And cycle time is the time frame around which those other things need to occur. For me, at Infosys, this was all leaders. Quality was, do I have consistently excellent leader behavior, potential, consequences that give the founders peace of mind that as they retire, there's a good chance that they can promote people into those senior roles. Or at more junior levels, as the company scales so rapidly, can they continue to recruit and grow leaders to a point that they can consistently perform well? So the term is intended to help you remember. It's intended to scrutinize seeing the cues of value creation and destruction, to help the leadership team create a mental model of value creation, and potentially use bio-inspired ideas to solve some of their wicked problems when a fresh idea can come from a solution that another organism has created. And the bottlenecks can be anywhere in the organization, but having a shared mental model about what the weak link might be could be useful so that all the people that aren't in the bottleneck may collaborate and help provide resources where they matter the most. So I piloted this in Finacle at Infosys, which is the banking software product, and I used it to try and help the senior team come to terms with their failure to scale past 250 million US dollars. They wanted to grow to $1 billion. Forrester and Gartner had lots of nice things to say about them, rated them #1 in their industry. But they had more customers than they could actually handle, and they couldn't scale. Their bottleneck wasn't where many people's are in the sales process, it was in execution, because banks are complicated, and none of us want our banks to have errors in them. So that transition process is quite difficult with legacy systems. It helped the leadership team focus their attention on that, and even though some of the salespeople would normally like to say, well, sales is the most important practice or process, that they could help the folks that were more in the delivery area. It also forced them to think carefully about, was everyone in that part of the bottleneck adding enough value, adding more value than they were consuming in terms of their salary, or were people playing as team players in that? So that framework they found helpful. Here's an example of how it would work. This isn't in Finacle, this is just in a service sector, in a barber shop. If they have macro level financial goals, there are a variety of different actions that have to happen to attract customers into the barber shop, even scheduling them before the customer can even get a haircut. But if you think of the other disciplines involved, it's not IO psychology, it's not all human behavior and cognition. Sure, the haircutting person has to be proficient at cutting and washing and greeting the person, but the chemicals and the shampoo, the physical assets, they're doing some of the work too. And so what's the appropriate combination of investments in these things, including but not limited to our work, that would help the barbershop owner achieve her objectives? If you go at even more of a micro level, you can go down into kind of the ONET classic, arm, hand steadiness, active listening, cognitive types of factors inside the person that allow them to do those behaviors well. But the same are true in our counterpart domains of chemistry and physics. So what I'm trying to do is help the leaders think carefully about all the different factors that are required to achieve their ultimate purpose, not just their favorite ones. Because I was definitely guilty of this earlier in my career, where I would solve the wrong problem with the third decimal point. And so the hope is this QC model was something that helps leaders avoid that. But it's very consistent with things you've heard at other parts of this conference from Bob Lord around thinking about leaders designing emergent effects. Ultimately, they want a bunch of people and physical assets and technology and ideas and intellectual property to create financial client outcomes. And it requires a sophistication to think at those cross levels of analysis, which I think is very contemporary with the way IO psychology research is going. But it requires us to be broad as well and recognize where human behavior or human cognition, affect, culture, climate, structure are not the right solution, so that we can size our investments and our interventions commensurate with the value they could be creating. Another area I got inspired from the biology was what our friends in strategy call the resource-based view of the firm. Can I see a show of hands? How many of you are familiar with the resource-based view of the firm? Okay, maybe about half of you. It's basically a premise that says organizations that have capabilities inside them that are tough for competitors to copy or mimic or substitute, give them competitive advantage. But it's been criticized by being tautological, that they don't clarify what value means. They'll say it means finances at the end or delighted clients. What the QC model allows you to do is put it in terms of utility. If your strategy can give lift to things customers will pay for, and they can't get that same effect in a different way, then that's useful in various ways to them. You know, at Infosys, it might be in terms of the consequences software have on their business. In that barbershop example, it might be a culture that creates such a warm feeling in the client that they only want to come back to that particular barbershop. So insofar as our interventions are rare, something that can't be mimicked or substituted, and are useful as measured by quality, cost, quantity, cycle time, it gives a different lens for us to think about when IO interventions can be strategic. So I use this extensively at Infosys, trying to help leaders think about how they can point their scarce innovation resources in the bottlenecks that could count the most. So, okay, that's an interesting idea, but I don't know if Sharman knew this, my nickname in grad school was Captain Empiricism. Did you know that, Sharman? So I haven't lost that. And so I tested in 5 different ways. One in a simulation where I looked at the meta-analytic predictors of leader behavior, and I wanted to see in a Monte Carlo simulation, did it seem to do something worthwhile before I inflicted on my global leaders, and it seemed to work okay. And then a colleague of mine, Dr. Artu Shamsunder, and I had done some validation work where we basically were able to show that we had a number of different predictors, distal stable and semi-malleable predictors. We had, they were decent regressions that predicted leader behavior and other consequences of it. But we had a strong need in the company to set standards. You know, how do we know if we got a good probability that these leaders can be successors? Our QC process was around selecting leaders, developing them, and developing to the point that they could succeed the founders. And so obviously I tried to practice what I teach. The classic Angoff methods for standard setting. I looked at an experiment where I randomly assigned my leaders to rating Angoff scales. There's another one in education psych called bookmarking. And then the third was my QC model, so I could get strong causal inferences. This approach basically said if I can squeeze variation out of the predictor variables, that itself would improve the distribution of consistently excellent leadership. But I could also put a second set of cut scores down on the behaviors themselves. Now, not every attribute might be something I want to maximize. I might want to have an optimal level. But the concept is that can I squeeze variation out? And what would happen if I took our classic IO-Psych standard setting procedures versus a QC approach that said, you know, I have limited budget. I can't get an infinitely large budget. And if I have my standards too high, I'm going to be looking for Gandhi, and I'm never going to get enough leaders that I can grow. So I neither wanted standards too high, nor did I want them too low, for obvious reasons, where we normally think. And it turned out that the Angoff and bookmark standards that the leaders themselves set, they couldn't meet. If I used their own standards on themselves, they wouldn't meet them, unless I used a compensatory approach. And for things like ethics and values, that was a non-starter. So we did not want a compensatory approach. So my model basically used an operations research approach. I used genetic algorithms and a Monte Carlo approach to simulate quite literally millions of alternative cut scores that got me as consistently high leader performance as I could get, but in the presence of a cost constraint and with a requirement that I'm only going to accept solutions that get me at least 800 leaders. That was a few years ago. Now that number's increased. So this is an approach that tried to respect the empirical evidence we already had about what predicts high-quality leadership, but established constraints on how many we need to be in the process, as well as respected the cost. And so this was a very credible approach to my senior leaders, unlike some of the utility analysis models of the past that are infamous for not being so credible, partially because I already established the logic chain between the ultimate purpose of why my institute existed, all the way through why we're using science, and Chris Gopalakrishnan is the only boss I've had that thanked me for using theory and empirical evidence in my proposal to him about how we set the standard. So I'm very proud of the fact that today you can't get promoted at Infosys unless you demonstrate that you're at or above these standards on our evidence-based instruments. So as I close the presentation today, another inspiration I had is right off the coast of Australia here, in the Great Barrier Reef, and it's a species called cleaner shrimp. Believe it or not, one of the bio-inspired creatures actually helps other fish in Australia remove the parasites that are troubling them. And these fish know this and swim to certain what are called cleaning stations so that these cleaner shrimp and other species can eat the parasites off of them. And I thought, okay, maybe we biopsychologists, we can be the cleaner shrimp of the organizational world. And if we think about this combination of shared, distributed, and instrumental leadership, that perhaps we can borrow from the superheroes of biopsychology, or at least my superheroes, like David Day, who promotes the idea of leadership and followership. I'm also very fond of John Antonakis and his work with Bob House on environmental scanning, strategy setting, goal setting, and of course, my old advisor, Charmin Hartel, around diagnostic decision-making and shared mental models that help people focus their attention on the bottlenecks which can matter the most. So if we back up and put it in perspective, India was a very interesting but difficult place for me to live, but I got to do this insanely great biopsychology, which I could have probably never done anywhere else, but it reminded me every single day that organizations make a huge difference in people's lives. The founders of Infosys that I was working for changed the face of India. I got a platform to talk about science-based practice almost every week in the national media, which would never be happening to me in the United States. And we can be a force for an ethical, evidence-based approach, especially if we use some of these creative ideas, perhaps from other disciplines at times, to give us fresh ideas that are worthy of being tested. And so as I think about those very leaders that were bothering me when I first moved to India, Barney Madoff, and then when I got there, I think there are many examples that aren't so cataclysmic, but are day-to-day, where people or organizational actors are destroying more value than they create. And we can be the change we want to see in the world, as Gandhi would say, by promoting our evidence in a way that others that don't know biopsychology can see, by learning their language, being focused on their dependent variables, their criteria, and then using that to inform the practice and also our science. I think this is especially true if you think north of here, when you think about the parasites that have infected North Korea versus South Korea, who wouldn't rather dance Gangnam Style versus march like the North Koreans? And so this is at every level. This isn't just at the micro-organizational level. This can be at the macro-organizational leadership level as well. Entrepreneurs like this inspired me. I moved back to the US. Murthy is the founder of Infosys. The man is just a wonderful human being. He treats the people that clean the toilets as wonderfully as he treats the Nobel Prize winners that I had the pleasure of meeting. He's a wonderful man, and I'm married to the other biopsychologist on this slide, who herself went through great hardship to get out of India, become a biopsychologist, start an evidence-based biopsych company in India and in the US. And it's those leaders that I want to apply the rest of my career of biopsychology to helping be successful. And so I want to leave you with just the idea that I think the world needs our work. Too few people know what we do. Whether we're mostly scientists, whether we're mostly practitioners, where can we help the world stop its bleeding? There is a lot of value destruction out there. Not all of it's as high profile as what the media sees. But the science and practice gap that, at least in the US, is talked about a lot, it troubles me because it's relatively rare that people like the guys I got to work for at Infosys want the evidence, demand the evidence. And yet, when it comes to their own healthcare, they would think nothing less than the evidence that they would prefer. So we're uniquely positioned to do that, but I would like to challenge you to really rethink things in terms that others who aren't IO people care about. And so I think if we can collaborate and put a spotlight on the truth of that value destruction that's not required, that our science can influence, we have a huge role to play in making the world a better place. There's just a couple of resources I will leave you with. AskNature.org is a really fascinating way to think about any kind of applied problem and then get some clues about what other organisms might be doing to solve that problem. My next book I do not own. Infosys gets all the money from it, but I have a lot more about this in Leading Value Creation, Organizational Science, Bioinspiration, and the QC model. And then I'm on Twitter. So I thank you so much for spending an afternoon with me and for inviting me here.
We have a few more minutes, and if anyone has questions, please raise your hand and either speak loudly or come to one of the microphones. But this is a great opportunity to ask Matt Barney some of the burning questions you have about science and practice. I'm actually blinded them with science.
Yes, please.
Could you please speak up? We really can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Could you come down to the microphone, please? We really can't hear you.
I think I heard, do the people at Infosys. I didn't hear anything else.
Is there a conflict for the people with whom whose values you're changing, literally, in the Indian environment, to not take bribes and so on? Do they still carry that into their other life? Because survival in India relies on small bribes every single day for little, it's the oil, it's the way of life, and, that's the way we live, and people feel proud of that, because I myself have bribed policemen in India, and so, you couldn't, it's the oil that makes the country work at that little level. Rupees here, rupees there, to go through the better door, through the whatever. Now, do you think that's moving out into the community from your people? Do you think, or do they have a conflict? Do they behave one way in Infosys and another in their real world?
It's a great empirical question. I would submit, so the company cares deeply about this issue. It is a role model to try and be as ethical as possible, and yet when you think about the sheer volumes of people they hire every year, and we know how effective all of our interventions are, I lose sleep over this myself, because I did not bribe any police, although I did scare them away once, where I was going to a wedding, and we'd asked the police for directions, and he saw a foreigner, so they think that's an opportunity to get a bribe, and I said, I'm not going to pay your bribe, but I took out my camera, and I said, I will put your picture on the internet, or you can run away, and he chose to run away. But you're right that it is every single day, it is a total fist fight to maintain ethical values, because it is deeply part of the culture. So the company has a huge investment. The campus where I was working is this gorgeous Disney World-like setting of 330 acres. It has an Epcot Center ball. It's absolutely fabulous, but they invest in things like, we did studies with Jim Dieter from Cornell on teaching moral disengagement. But it's a good example where, your entire family and everyone you ever knew were, behaving in ways that even they would agree were not morally reasonable. Can you fundamentally change people? And it turns out in his most recent study that the Machiavellian types actually got worse from the intervention. They became doing more emotional labor to trick the rest of the world and more convinced of their classical ways. But they were able to show effects from their intervention for the non-Machiavellian types. So I suspect the answer is there's variation in these, but Infosys is trying extremely hard to move that distribution toward what Australians or Western Europeans or Americans would say would be normal ethical business practice. But it's extremely hard with the huge numbers and the sheer history of how long India's been this way. Any other questions? Comments?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, and Matt, don't run away. I just want to thank you very much for that very stimulating talk. It's a great example of innovative and disciplined practice based on science and evidence, and it's something we should be doing more, as you say. But another thing that really impressed me is the perspective that you take that's not just multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, but it's transdisciplinary. It's creating a new way of looking at things and synthesizing across various fields. And I think IO psychologists and IO psychology is going to need to think more like this if we're going to be relevant as the 21st century unfolds. So thanks for leading the way on that. And we have a small token of our appreciation for you coming here and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you very much. I know this is the end of a long day for us.